Welcome to the Deep Dive. Great to have you with us again as we get into another really interesting set of source materials.
Good to be here.
So today we're focusing on France. We've got some pretty detailed reports, analyses, looking at a few key things. The economy, where it stands, its big push towards a greener future, and really close look at the education system.
That's right.
Our mission, like always, is to sort of guide you through all this information. We're here to pull out the most important bits, the key insights from these sources, basically give you the shortcut, right? So you can understand these, well, quite complex areas without getting totally bogged down.
Yeah, exactly.
What really jumps out to you when you look at these topics? Let's dive in.
Absolutely. The materials we've been, digging into, they give a pretty rounded picture. On the economy, we're seeing recent performance, yeah, but also some significant fiscal hurdles and what the growth prospects look like. Then for the green transition, it's all about those national climate goals, how far they've actually come, which sectors are the big emitters, and, the policies they're trying to use.
Right.
And then education, the sources, give us this detailed look at the structure, the outcomes, both overall and, crucially, the equity piece, the teaching profession itself, and how the whole system's trying to adapt, for the future and look after student well-being.
It's quite a mix, isn't it? Gives you a real multifaceted view of the country. I think we're going to uncover some maybe surprising facts, key takeaways that really show the balancing acts France is juggling right now.
Definitely. Managing today while trying to build for tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in. Let's start with the big picture, France's economy. The material you've got highlights that, like a lot of places, France has faced some pretty big successive shocks recently.
That's right. I mean, the period these sources cover, it really shows the impact first of the COVID pandemic, and then bam, the surge in inflation right after. These weren't small bumps in the road. They needed massive government action, really on an unprecedented scale.
And the sources mentioned these emergency measures were, well, absolutely vital during that time.
Exactly. They were designed like a shield. Things like the furlough scheme to keep people in jobs, direct cash help for businesses and families, those price caps on energy to stop costs going through the roof, various allowances just to prop up purchasing power.
Critical safety nets.
Absolutely vital, yeah. They helped cushion that immediate blow from the crises.
But that level of support, even though it was needed, it obviously comes at a cost. And the sources are really clear on this, a high fiscal cost.
Precisely. And that high cost leads directly to where we are now, fiscally speaking. The sources really stress that getting a handle on the huge government debt that piled up is now, well, essential.
And a main way to do that.
Reducing public spending. It's the clear consequence of all that support handed out during the crises.
Okay, digging into the recent numbers in the sources, GDP growth, it looks like it's going to stay pretty modest in 2024.
Yeah, the projections you shared are hovering around, 0.8% for 2024. The sources see a gradual recovery kicking in, getting back towards potential growth, maybe household purchasing power improving a bit in 2025. They're projecting 1.3% then.
Right, 1.3%. But that modest 0.8% for 2024, it's especially interesting when the sources say it follows a period of what they call low trend growth that actually started before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really key point. What's fascinating is that between, end of 2009 and end of 2019, a whole decade, basically GDP growth averaged only 1.5% a year.
Only 1.5%.
Right. So this wasn't just a blip. It was a long stretch of slower expansion compared to how things used to be, or compared to many other countries. And that long period of slower growth, it's been a major constraint, holding back improvements in income, overall prosperity for a long time, even before these latest shocks hit everyone. It points to a deeper sort of structural challenge France has been dealing with.
Okay, let's unpack another critical piece the sources look at, productivity. It seems like potential growth and productivity have both slowed down.
Yes, the material points that out. This deceleration has been happening in recent years, but maybe more worryingly, productivity growth itself has actually been trending downwards for the last 2 decades.
2 decades, wow.
Yeah, one of the figures you mentioned, figure 2, it shows this visually. You can see this sustained slowdown, how France's productivity performance has weakened over time.
So why is this happening? According to the sources, what are the specific reasons behind this low growth and productivity?
Well, they highlight several things. It's not just one factor. The sources talk about skills, not enough of the right skills, or skills not matching up with what employers actually need. Mismatches, basically.
Okay, skills mismatch.
Then there's the slow uptake of digital tech within companies. Especially, the smaller, medium-sized ones, the SMEs.
Yeah.
They seem to lag behind bigger firms or companies in other countries. Figure 3.2 shows that lag.
Right, digital adoption.
Plus, they mention high regulatory barriers in some sectors, things that might stifle competition, innovation, and finally, lower R&D efficiency. Which is interesting because France actually has really generous tax breaks for private R&D, some of the highest in the OECD. Figure 3.3 shows that.
But it's not translating.
Exactly. The sources suggest it's not translating into the kind of innovation, output, or productivity gains you might expect.
So it's a complicated mix, isn't it? Human capital, tech adoption, regulations, how effective R&D spending is. How does this link to jobs? The employment rate has gone up, which is good news.
It is, yeah.
But it's still below the OECD average, even if it's near France's own historical highs. And unemployment is still above the OECD average.
Right. So the sources talk about recent policies aimed specifically at helping people get into work and stay there. There's that law on full employment, for instance.
Yeah.
It explicitly sets a goal of achieving full employment, getting more people participating in the labor market. And there's a big focus on intensive, tailored support for those who are furthest from finding a job, people facing big barriers.
Makes sense.
Apprenticeships, too, they've had huge policy and financial backing recently, and that's definitely helped with youth employment figures, which look relatively strong.
Right. I sense a but.
Well, the sources do raise a nuanced point. They discuss whether this massive support for apprenticeships might have led to some job substitution, employers choosing apprentices instead of regular hires, rather than purely creating new jobs.
Ah.
And they also question if maybe the support could be better targeted towards young people with lower initial skills, the ones who usually struggle most to get into the job market on their own. Figure 3.7 touches on those youth challenges.
Right, targeting the support.
Yeah.
Okay, now, this is where it gets really interesting on the fiscal side. And honestly, quite striking. The sources point out something pretty remarkable. France has the highest public spending relative to GDP among all OECD countries.
It does. Figure 2.14 makes that crystal clear. France is right at the top.
That's huge.
It's a major, persistent feature of the French economy. And this exceptionally high level of public spending, it directly leads to what the sources call one of the heaviest tax to GDP ratios in the whole OECD.
Which can't be good for competitiveness.
Well, that's the concern. This high tax burden can potentially hurt competitiveness by pushing up costs for businesses, for individuals, and that could impact potential growth in the long run.
Any specific taxes called out?
Taxes on labor are mentioned specifically as being particularly high. Employer Social Security contributions are the highest in the OECD.
How high are we talking?
The total tax wedge on labor, that's the total tax burden on employing someone, is 47.0%. The OECD average is 34.6%.
Wow, that's a big difference.
And employer Social Security contributions alone make up 26.7% of labor costs. That significantly bumps up the cost of hiring for businesses.
And this high spending, high taxes,
Yeah.
it feeds right into the public debt situation, doesn't it? The sources show debt is already high, and it's shot up since the start of the decade.
Exactly. Driven higher by those large deficits during and after the crises. Figure 2.12 shows that upward path, climbing well over 100% of GDP.
So connecting back to what we said earlier about the cost of the support measures.
Yeah, the sources really hammer home the need to get those public deficits down through fiscal consolidation, meaning basically reducing public spending and making both spending and those tax expenditures more efficient. They mention spending reviews being introduced as a tool specifically for that, finding areas where public money could be used better or maybe cut back.
Do the sources give specific examples of where cuts or efficiencies might be found?
They do. They mention looking at health spending areas like sick pay rules, how drugs are reimbursed. They point to certain loan and investment schemes that might not be hitting the mark efficiently.
Right.
Reducing employment support when unemployment is already low and the job market's tight. Re-looking at the government's share of training costs. Tighter budget control over state-run operators. And phasing out fuel tax concessions, those implicit fossil fuel subsidies.
Right.
There was also mention of an extra EUR 10 billion spending cut announced early in 2024, so efforts are ongoing.
And tax expenditures, those tax breaks and exemptions, they're another big area.
Definitely considered significant. They added up to 3.2% of GDP in 2022. That's a lot of potential revenue.
And the sources think they could be more effective.
Yeah, significantly improved. They mention efforts are underway to scrap some 60 were meant to go by 2024, but the implication is more could be done.
Any specific examples?
Reduced VAT rates get a specific mention. They represent about EUR 10 billion in lost revenue. And the sources question whether these reduced rates always help the poorest households as much as intended.
Who benefits most then?
Well, they note they primarily benefit the companies in those sectors like catering or home renovation work, so the distributive impact, who really gains, might be limited.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's look at the financial side of the economy. The sources suggest that monetary policy changes, interest rate hikes from the central bank seem to have fully worked their way through into financial conditions.
That seems to be the case. As the European Central Bank raised rates significantly to fight inflation, lending activity definitely slowed down.
That's borrowing.
Right. But there's an interesting nuance in the sources. They suggest this slowdown in lending seems more about falling demand for loans from businesses and households.
Because it's more expensive and uncertain.
Exactly. Higher borrowing costs, economic uncertainty, rather than banks tightening the supply of credit. Figure 2.8 backs that up, showing reduced demand.
And the housing market is feeling those higher rates too, slowing down.
It is. House prices have started to dip, but the sources say the downturn looks relatively contained, maybe less severe than in some other big euro area countries. Figure 2.9 compares them. France looks a bit milder.
Okay.
Naturally, rising borrowing costs mean less housing investment. Mortgages are just more expensive, but the impact on people who already have mortgages is limited.
Why is that?
Because in France, mortgages are mostly fixed rate, so existing borrowers are protected from those rising interest payments.
Ah, that's a key difference.
Yeah. And plus, new rules came in since 2022 that limit how long loans can be and the effort ratio, how much of your income goes to debt payments. That's meant to reduce risk across the whole system, stop households getting over-leveraged.
But what about overall household debt levels?
That has risen over the last decade as a share of GDP, and it's now higher than in other big euro area countries. Figure 2.10 shows that increase. France is above the euro area average there. So that's one potential vulnerability compared to some neighbors.
But companies, businesses, seem to be on firmer ground, even though their debt is also relatively high compared to some others.
Yes, that's the picture the sources paint. Corporate debt is higher than the euro area average, yeah. But their cash flow actually shot up in 2020-21, partly thanks to crisis support.
Right.
And it's stayed above 2019 levels since then. Profit margins are back near pre-pandemic levels, suggesting resilience.
And bankruptcies.
They were kept incredibly low during all that government support, as shown in Figure 2.1. Now they're returning to pre-pandemic levels, which is expected. And banks themselves actually did well in 2022, their income boosted by the higher interest rates.
Okay, that gives us a really solid feel for the economic landscape, the fiscal pressures, the productivity challenge, how monetary policy is playing out. Now let's switch gears completely. Let's talk about a massive global issue in France's approach. The green transition. Your sources say France has set some ambitious climate goals.
They have indeed. There's a provisional national goal: cut total greenhouse gas emissions down to 270 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030.
270 million tons. How does that compare to before?
That's aiming for a 50% reduction from 1990 levels, which is, well, a pretty significant undertaking for just 7 years from 2023.
Sounds huge.
Mm.
But the sources also flag a big challenge in actually hitting that target.
Yes, this is a really key message. They point out, look, France did cut emissions by 25% between 1990 and 2022. But getting that next 25% cut by 2030, that needs what they call a rapid acceleration of effort.
So faster progress needed.
Much faster. Figure 4.1 shows this gap really clearly. The current path just isn't steep enough to hit that 2030 target. It requires a really decisive push across lots of different sectors, starting now.
It's interesting, though, the sources mention France's domestic emissions are relatively low compared to other countries.
Yeah, and that's partly down to that historical choice to rely heavily on nuclear power for electricity. Nuclear has very low operational emissions compared to burning fossil fuels.
But there's a catch.
Well, the sources add this important layer by looking at demand-based emissions.
What does that mean exactly?
It includes the environmental impact of everything consumed in France, no matter where it was actually produced. So it counts the emissions embedded in imports.
Ah, the stuff we buy from elsewhere.
Exactly. And those demand-based emissions, they're significantly higher than domestic emissions. Still below the OECD average. Figure 4.2 shows that difference, but it highlights that consumption patterns, the footprint of imported goods. That's a crucial part of the picture, too. Just cutting domestic production emissions isn't the whole story.
So which sectors are the biggest emitters domestically? Where does the focus need to be for those cuts?
Transport comes out top, responsible for a big chunk, 30% of total emissions in 2021.
30%. Yeah.
Then comes industry at 21%, buildings at 18%, and agriculture at 16%. Figure 4.3 breaks that down. And the sources are really clear. Emissions from transport and buildings specifically need to drop sharply by 2030 to meet those national goals. Figure 4.4 shows the required path for those sectors, their definite priority areas.
Okay, so what tools are being used to drive this? What do the sources say about how well they're working? Carbon pricing gets mentioned.
Yes, carbon pricing is a key economic lever, right? Making emissions costly. The EU's emission trading scheme, the ETS, covers about 21% of France's emissions, mostly big industry and power plants. Key things are financial incentives for buying electric vehicles, EVs. They mention support for new ones, but also for the secondhand market, which is interesting.
Okay.
Plus efforts to improve public transport quality, reach, and encouraging things like cycling, building the infrastructure for it. And the forces point out France already has pretty high taxes on petrol and diesel compared to other European countries. That acts as a sort of baseline discouragement for traditional cars.
And buildings, another big slice of the emissions pie, especially heating and cooling.
Absolutely. Making existing buildings more energy efficient is crucial. Lots of retrofitting needed. And the sources say this requires really significant extra investment by 2030.
How much are we talking?
An estimated EUR 21 billion per year for homes and EUR 27 billion per year for commercial and public buildings. Huge numbers.
Wow. So how are they supporting that?
France has major national programs like MaPrimeRénov' and zero-interest loans specifically for these renovations, and these programs got a boost for 2024 made more generous. They increased income thresholds so more people qualify, and they're covering a higher share of the costs, up to 90% for the lowest income households. The aim is to make those deep, comprehensive renovations more affordable.
But are people doing the deep renovations?
Well, these sources know that those really deep, comprehensive renovations are still only a small fraction of the total projects getting support, like 1.7% in some programs. They suggest simplifying the paperwork and maybe increasing help specifically for landlords could speed things up.
Makes sense. What about industry and boosting renewable energy?
For industry, decarbonizing means supporting big investments in new, cleaner ways of producing things. And for renewables, the sources really stress. A massive speed up in investment is needed to get more renewables online and replace fossil fuels.
How's that going?
Well, even though they added a record amount of new renewable capacity in 2022, France was still likely to miss its 2023 targets. Figure 4.6 shows the share of renewables is growing, but it started low and it's still relatively small compared to overall energy needs.
So roadblocks.
Yeah. Things like the Renewable Energy Acceleration Act from early 2023 are trying to streamline the permitting process, cut through red tape that slowed things down historically.
And nuclear.
The sources mention that boosting nuclear output could also play a big role in decarbonizing electricity since it provides that low-carbon baseload power. Interestingly, they also note the plan to close the last coal power plants got pushed back from 2022 to 2027.
A balancing act there too. Energy security versus transition speed.
Exactly. Highlights the trade-offs.
Agriculture and land use were also mentioned sources of emissions, but also potential carbon sinks.
Yes. Shifting farming towards more sustainable practices is needed, cutting methane, nitrous oxide, improving soil health. But a really big challenge highlighted is reversing this sharp, worrying decline in carbon sinks.
Meaning forests, soils aren't absorbing as much CO2.
Precisely. The amount absorbed in 2021 was only 17 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The target was 41 million tons, less than half. Fixing that decline is critical for hitting the overall climate targets. And, connecting this to the bigger picture, climate change isn't just about cutting emissions, right? It's also about adapting to the impacts we can no longer avoid, impacts that are already happening and getting worse.
Adaptation alongside mitigation. What kind of impacts is France already seeing and needing to prepare more for?
Several clear hazards linked to climate change. Extreme heat days have increased significantly, posing risks to health, infrastructure. Figure 4.7 shows that rising exposure. Wildfires are much worse. The area burned annually was 4.4 times larger between 2019 and 2023 compared to the 5 years before.
Oh, 4.4 times.
Yeah. Agricultural drought is hitting crops harder. River floods affect a significant number of people and buildings. Windstorms are a recurring threat, too.
So planning how to respond to these things efficiently seems crucial, right? To
Yes.
limit the damage and the cost.
Absolutely. The sources say efficient planning for adaptation can help lessen the economic burden and disruption. But they also point out a big challenge. Public awareness.
People don't know the risks.
Apparently quite low. A survey mentioned found half the people asked felt poorly informed about the specific climate risks right where they live, which raises a big question about how you effectively communicate these risks and get people on board with adaptation measures to build resilience.
Right. Okay, moving from climate and the economy into the classroom. Let's look at France's education system. Your sources describe it as highly centralized, run mainly by the Ministry of National Education and Youth.
That's a key feature mentioned right away, very top-down structure. And the system faces some pretty significant challenges, especially around equity, even if some overall results are around the OECD average.
But the sources quickly point out a major issue. While average scores, like on PASA tests, might be near the OECD average. Figure 5.1 shows that, though other tests like TIMSS are sometimes below the outcomes in France, are more unequal than in many other countries.
Yeah, this inequality is a critical, persistent problem. It comes up again and again in the sources as a core weakness. How well a student does is strongly tied to their socioeconomic background, their family's cultural status.
More so than elsewhere.
Yes, that's what's really concerning and stands out. This effect, how much your background determines your school success, is bigger in France than the OECD average. The sources say socioeconomic status predicts 21.5% of the difference in math scores in France, compared to 15.5% across the OECD. Figure 5.2 has that stark data.
So the system is less effective at compensating for disadvantage.
Exactly. Less effective at leveling the playing field compared to systems in other developed countries.
The sources also look at spending within the system. Seems like more goes to secondary schools than primary.
Yes, relative to the OECD average, spending per student is higher in secondary than primary. Figure 5.3 shows that difference. So to tackle those deep-rooted inequalities early, the sources suggest continuing to shift spending towards primary schools.
Especially in disadvantaged areas.
Exactly, funneling more resources there. France does have these priority education zones, REP and REP Playlight, which get extra funding. But the sources also suggest maybe giving schools in those areas more freedom, more autonomy, especially over things like hiring teachers, tailoring support programs, could make those extra resources more effective on the ground.
Makes sense. Now, a quality system needs quality teachers. The sources say French teachers are actually among the most qualified in the OECD. High level of education themselves.
That's true, yeah. 70% had a master's degree or higher back in 2018, and that's been the requirement since 2010. So formal qualifications are definitely a strength.
But challenges remain in making the job attractive.
Oh, yes. The sources detail some significant hurdles that affect recruitment, keeping teachers in the job. Statutory salaries, the official pay scales, are below the OECD average, especially for teachers starting out and for primary teachers. Figure 5.6 shows that comparison.
And workload, stress.
Teachers report high stress levels, partly from keeping up with frequent policy changes, figure 5.8 mentions that, and workload, definitely. Especially primary teachers, who teach significantly more hours per year than their OECD counterparts. Figure 5.7 shows that difference.
What do teachers themselves say are the biggest issues?
Purchasing power and workload. Those are highlighted in the sources as the absolute top priorities for teachers when asked what needs improving.
Have there been efforts to raise pay recently?
Yes, quite significant budget allocated since 2020 specifically for teacher pay, EUR 7.7 billion between 2020 and 2024.
What did that fund?
Things like raising the minimum net monthly salary, which helps early career teachers most, and introducing bonuses for teachers who take on extra tasks through this Teachers Pact that got about EUR 1 billion a year.
But is it enough?
Well, the sources suggest further increases are still needed, particularly for primary and mid-career teachers, to get their overall pay closer to the OECD average and make the job more competitive.
What other aspects of the teaching profession need attention, according to the sources?
Career prospects are mentioned as a big concern. The path for professional growth, advancement, it isn't always clear or appealing. Teacher appraisals, evaluations, they're infrequent average every 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, which means many teachers might not get appraised at all after 20 years on the job. That limits chances for structured feedback, professional development, recognition.
And training, continuing professional development.
That's another area flagged as needing significant work. It's described as complex, fragmented, quality varies a lot, and often it doesn't meet teachers' actual needs. Teachers themselves report feeling less prepared for the pedagogical side, the actual craft of teaching, managing a classroom compared to teachers in other OECD countries.
So initial training needs work too.
The practical experience part of initial training needs beefing up, to better prepare new teachers for classroom realities. They also mentioned teacher supply challenges, shortages in certain subjects, certain regions. Teaching master's students apparently get put off by workload worries and difficulties getting enough practical experience. Figure 5.18 highlights the need for training on inclusion, too.
What about how teachers teach? Any insights there? Classroom practices.
Yes, the sources note French teachers tend to use cognitive activation practices less often than their OECD peers.
Cognitive activation, meaning
Methods that really push students towards analytical thinking, critical thought, problem solving. Figure 5.4 shows that difference. But on the plus side, French teachers apparently provide more feedback to students than the OECD average.
so a mix.
Yeah. The sources suggest a balanced approach might be best strong knowledge transmission plus teaching methods that really engage students actively. They also briefly mention AI tools as a potential future support for teachers and students.
Interesting. What about class sizes? Is that discussed?
It's mentioned that reducing class sizes can help learning, especially for younger kids, but it's also very expensive. The sources suggest weighing that cost against the benefits of other strategies, like boosting teacher pay, training, or improving working conditions.
Right, trade-offs again. Let's circle back to that critical issue, equity. The sources really focus on that bigger gap in outcomes for disadvantaged students.
Yes, it's a major theme running through the whole education section. As we said, resources are targeted to schools in those priority zones, but the sources reiterate, maybe giving those schools more autonomy, especially over hiring and how they use funds locally, could help them better tackle their students' specific challenges.
And there was that point about peer influence.
Yes, fascinating point, backed by data. The sources highlight how much a student's peers' socioeconomic background can influence their test scores, sometimes even more than the student's own background. Figure 5.9 shows that powerful peer effect.
Which underlines why diversity within schools matters.
Exactly. It suggests increasing social and economic diversity within schools could actually benefit all students, not just those from disadvantaged backgrounds, because of those positive peer effects.
Are there specific efforts mentioned to increase diversity in schools?
They mention efforts, particularly involving private schools that are under contract with the state they educate about a fifth of students. There are agreements aiming to get these schools to enroll more scholarship kids from lower income families and encourage them to focus on classes with specific needs.
Transparency, too.
Yeah, a public database is planned showing access conditions and social diversity levels in these private schools under contract to make things clearer. The sources do note that, on average, these private schools tend to have more advantaged students than public schools. Figure 5.11 shows that, so there's definitely room to improve the social mix. And looking ahead, the education system also needs to keep adapting, right? Meeting future needs, reducing early school leaving.
That's so important for young people moving into the workforce.
Absolutely. Young people who leave school without at least an upper secondary qualification, they really struggle to find stable jobs. The employment rate for 25-34-year-olds without that qualification is only 52% in France. The OECD average is 61%. Table 5.3 shows that gap.
What's being done about that?
Well, policies are in place. Education or training is mandatory for 16-18-year-olds if they aren't employed. There are initiatives targeting students flagged as at risk of dropping out. But the sources suggest identifying struggling students even earlier is key, possibly using systems like SIEI, which is designed for early identification and support.
And work-based training, apprenticeships, you mentioned they were popular.
Yes, Figure 5.12 clearly shows that work experience during education really helps later job prospects. Apprenticeship numbers have shot up in France recently, which is positive.
Yeah.
But work-study programs more generally aren't used as much in France compared to the OECD average. Figure 5.33 shows that. So there might be potential to expand that kind of work-integrated learning further.
And aligning training with future job needs.
Big focus there. Efforts are underway to update locational pathways so they match where the jobs are going to be. Things like healthcare, science, education. IT Figure 5.14 highlights needs there reflecting demographics, tech changes.
So updating courses.
Yeah, a significant chunk of vocational courses are being revamped specifically for the digital and green transitions and the challenges of an aging population. It involves phasing out less relevant pathways and creating new ones in high-demand fields. They also note a mismatch between skills people have and skills needed more. French employees report their field of study doesn't match their job compared to the OECD average. Career guidance is another area flagged for improvement.
How so? Problems with advice students get.
It seems the current system relies a lot on teachers and school psychologists. The sources suggest it could benefit from counselors who have deeper, more up-to-date knowledge of the actual labor market, different industries. Plus, coordinating all the different guidance bodies outside schools, apparently there are around 8,000 of them, is a big challenge. Makes it hard for students and parents to navigate.
Wow, 8,000. Finally, the sources touch on well-being at school, so important for learning.
Absolutely fundamental. Bullying is highlighted as a concern. The frequency is close to the OECD average, but sadly it's gotten worse since 2018. Figure 5.17 shows that trend.
And discipline, teacher stress.
Lack of discipline, violence in schools that impacts the learning environment and definitely adds to teacher stress. Stress levels for both primary and secondary teachers in France are higher than the OECD average. Figure 5.18 indicates this, linking it partly to dealing with behavior issues.
Are there policies to address this?
Policies and protocols exist, yes, but the sources suggest they really need everyone involved, students, parents, teachers, administrators pulling together to be effective.
In students with disabilities?
Supports is provided through things like small classes, special units within mainstream schools, but teacher training for inclusion, really preparing teachers to effectively teach and support kids with diverse needs in regular classrooms, that's highlighted as a significant need in France. Figure 5.19 shows that. Teachers themselves reported feeling an extra workload when including students with disabilities, underlining why good training and support are crucial.
Okay. Shifting slightly, our sources also gave us a quick peek at France's global trade links, using Uzbekistan as an example. Just gives a flavor of the diversity of its economic ties.
Yeah, it's a specific snapshot. Looking at 2023 data, France exported about $581 million worth of goods to Uzbekistan, mostly high-value stuff, planes, helicopters, spacecraft.
And imports from Uzbekistan.
Much smaller, $98.6 million, mainly radioactive chemicals. But the sources note that trade between these two, while just a small part of France's total, has actually grown quite a bit recently. Shows how relationships evolve.
And the broader context puts France where, globally, in trade?
In 2023, France ranked 16th on the Economic Complexity Index, measuring the sophistication of its exports, and 7th overall in total exports globally, at $635 billion. So yeah, this really underlines France is a major, highly developed, diversified trading nation way beyond just that one example.
And just for a final dash of culture from sources, some details on tourism in Paris. Always a key sector, especially post-pandemic.
Definitely. Paris and the surrounding region, Ile-de-France, had about 48 million tourist arrivals in 2023. That's a strong comeback, nearly hitting the 2019 peak before everything shut down.
Who's visiting? And spending.
Domestic tourists were the majority of arrivals, but international visitors brought in the big bucks, roughly EUR 14 billion in spending. Big boost for the local economy. Top countries for arrivals were the US, UK, and Italy. For spending, it was US, UK, and Germany leading the pack.
And the big attractions,
Yeah.
the must-sees mentioned.
The Louvre Museum came out top, most visited museum monument in Paris in 2023, and actually the most visited museum in the whole world.
Still number one.
Yep. The Eiffel Tower was second in Paris, also hugely popular. And Disneyland Paris, just outside the city, pulled in over 10 million visitors in 2023. Shows the appeal of theme parks alongside the cultural icons.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive on France. We've looked at the economy, the green transition challenges, the education system, drawing on all those sources you brought, plus that quick look at trade and tourism.
We really have dug in. We saw that constant balancing act, haven't we? Between managing the high debt from recent shocks and yet needing massive investment for the future, especially in the green transition and improving education.
Yeah.
We explored those structural hurdles like boosting productivity, which has been lagging for 2 decades now, and the efforts to get more people into jobs, tackling skills gaps.
And education equity stood out.
Definitely. That persistent, significant challenge of ensuring fairness, where your background still plays a bigger role than in many peer countries, despite spending quite a bit in certain areas, plus the ongoing work to make teaching more attractive, adapt training for the future, make classrooms more inclusive.
We also touched on the sheer ambition behind those climate goals, didn't we? And the huge effort needed to really speed up progress, particularly in transport and buildings. Plus, that whole adaptation piece, preparing for unavoidable climate impacts, getting the public aware, it really gives you this complex, layered picture of where France is at, the challenges, and the big policy pushes happening.
Which, it raises a really interesting question as you look at how all these things connect. You've got the fiscal pressure, the need for huge green and educational investment, the productivity puzzle, the equity goal. Could it be that improvements in one area, say, making the education system more effective, more equitable, better at equipping people with the right skills, could that simultaneously help boost productivity and make the workforce and industries better prepared for the green and digital shifts?
Like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. Could you create a virtuous cycle where progress in education actually helps tackle several of these big economic and environmental challenges at the same time?
Hmm. A lot to think about there, definitely. It's clear these issues are deeply intertwined, isn't it? Progress in one probably depends heavily on progress in the others.
Hmm.
Well, thank you for bringing all these fascinating sources to us and walking us through this deep dive. We really hope this has given you, our listeners, some valuable insights and maybe sparked a few new questions for you to explore yourself. Until our next deep dive.